we're in big trouble for the future. We are leaving a much worse legacy for future generations. You need to seize the moment when there are specific pieces of legislation coming through Parliament. You take Britain as a whole, it's 2%, but most of the 2% is in Scotland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sphere of Success, the podcast that looks at challenge and adversity in business and how we can overcome that, looking at alchemizing it to positivity, growth, resilience, and innovation. And today we are going to be looking at rewilding business, how nature-based solutions drive innovation, resilience, and profitability. Because a lot of people might be thinking, well, actually, to be eco-friendly, to be thinking about connectivity with nature and business, that's going to be expensive. How can my business afford to do this? I'm up to my ears in it already. And actually, this is just the icing on the cake. It's just too much. But I have to say, I've got the most amazing guest with us today, and I'm just about to introduce him. This man can really make things happen, and he's not your typical eco warrior either. So I think you'll be very interested to hear what he's got to say. So without further ado, I'm going to read his bio. Welcome to Professor Alastair Driver, BSc Hons, FCIEEM, conservationist, rewilder, and explorer. A very interesting man. He's travelled the world. There's lots of stories that he can tell us. Professor Alastair Driver is one of the UK's best known conservationists and is cited in Who's Who for his influence and distinction in the field of environmental conservation. He has enjoyed a long and distinguished career for nearly 50 years, including serving as National Head of Conservation for the Environment Agency for 15 years and Director of Rewilding Britain for 8 years. He is now the Senior Advisor for the Global Rewilding Alliance and a specialist consultant in rewilding and nature recovery, which includes acting as a specialist advisor for Heal, Rewilding, and for Broughton Sanctuary in Yorkshire. He continues to play a key role in influencing government policy at the highest level and advising on large rewilding initiatives across the UK, and increasingly so internationally. Alastair also holds several pro bono roles, including Honorary Professor at University of Exeter, Specialist Advisor for River Action UK, and Natural England Landscape Advisory Panel Member. Professor Alastair, what a pleasure to have you on the programme. It's absolutely delightful, and what a topic to get into, because this is something very close to my heart. And I would love you to tell us a little bit more about your story and what got you into the most amazing ecological exploration, rewilding world that you're now in.
Well, thank you, Deborah. Thanks for that introduction. Yes, it's been an amazing journey for me because I had the privilege to have an upbringing in the middle of nowhere in the Cotswolds with a father who was a really keen naturalist, biologist, who was quite a charismatic individual. We could have a whole session on his eccentricity, but well, that'll have to be for another day. But he taught me an awful lot about nature from the start, and I've subsequently had the privilege of a career in nature conservation, which certainly when I went to university in the 70s was unlikely because there were so few jobs. But it's that immersion in nature as a child with learning that came from my father. So I know I must have been a right geeky little kid, but by the time I was 4 years old, he had a recording of me identifying all the British birds out of the field guide to British birds. So not just a handful of species, but pretty much everything by rote from the pages of the illustrations. And he taught me what birdsong was. And by the time I was 8 years old, I was collecting insects, pinning them, collecting birds' eggs, all these things which you don't do, shouldn't do nowadays, because we have digital photography, and indeed egg collecting is largely illegal. So yeah, sort of old-fashioned country naturalist upbringing, which gave me that understanding of what's around me. What plant is that? What bird is that singing? What butterfly is that? What moth? And and once you've got that understanding, it's much easier to then become really passionate about the subject.
That's incredible. And a lot has changed from the 70s. And I know before we came on air, we've been discussing our great childhoods about being able to explore the countryside largely on our own or with our friends on our bikes or walking around and actually seeing nature and being in nature and enjoying all of the gifts that nature has to give us in a very relaxed and informal way. And for me, that's how I learned about the countryside is actually being in it. But not everybody's blessed with that. And today as well, we have to think of child safety, etc. So going out and exploring on our own isn't necessarily what it used to be. And so, how has that, do you think, affected people's mindsets today about nature, about the countryside, about ecology, perhaps not being able to, as we were as children, to be actively immersed in that on a daily basis?
Yeah, we've certainly become much more detached from nature over the last 50 years or so, 50, 60 years. So in the 60s when I was literally roaming the countryside all day long, I knew when it was time to come home for tea, and that was about it. The parish boundary was kind of my playground, and out in the woods, damming streams, up in trees, whatever, chewing soil. Often talk about, we need to chew more dirt because that's given us health and well-being benefits through, resistance to disease, etc. That, just having a good gut bacteria is something that actually goes with that detachment from nature. And we've lost that sadly. Um, so so there's no doubt that as we've sort of shrunk back into our houses and gardens and our, iPhones, we have lost that connection and we've lost the understanding, and therefore we don't value nature like we should. We have a really bizarre situation in this country where we probably have the greatest proportion of people who are members of environmental organizations, which is something like, probably 6 million or so people are members of the likes of the National Trust, Wildlife Trust, RSPB, etc., all these other dozens and dozens of charities. So we have this huge proportion of people that you would think, are a fantastic army for reconnection with nature. And yet we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And stats show that. So we have this, incredible disparity between casual interest and genuine knowledge and engagement.
And how is that shown in the business world? Because obviously, I can see a correlation between the lack of connectivity with people and the landscape and the nature-based solutions to actually coming into business and thinking about that as something which I always used to look, excuse me, the past employers. Yes, I did used to daydream, look out the window, see the birds flying, etc. Look out, see the spiders on the window ledge, and all of that, and actually bring that in and actually have it within me innately as to how I was at one in that sense with nature. How is this lack of connectivity now showing up in business decisions with regards to how we're bringing nature-based solutions into business?
Well, before I go into that, perhaps I can just mention at the
Mm,
political level, because obviously government policy and strategy drives
absolutely.
business policies and influence. And the the desperate problem we face, and this is not aligned to any particular party. Basically, all the political parties are the same in this respect. Um, the basic problem we face is that we still have not fully recognized that a healthy economy and a healthy society is dependent on a healthy environment.
Mm,
And a healthy environment is dependent on healthy nature, species, plants and animals. And although there are plenty of reports, Dasgupta report, for government a few years ago, for Treasury, in fact, which demonstrated clearly that you cannot have a healthy economy without healthy natural resources. We still haven't actually done an awful lot about it at that highest level. And in fact, you see that right now with the Treasury and the Treasury Minister now seeking to reduce environmental protections in order to deliver more growth. Now, as I say, I don't want to get into political issues, but that is a fundamental mistake that repeatedly governments of all kinds have not recognized. So it starts at the top, and then that cascades down into business. Because if businesses are just incentivized to steamroll their way through the countryside, developers, for example, with less regard for the environment, in a country where we're going backwards on biodiversity, and we have great data to show that, then we're in big trouble for the future. We are leaving a much worse legacy for future generations. But I would like to, I'll pause there, but I would like to come on to the positive news because I tend to focus very much in my career and my talks about good news stories. And, that's the baseline that we're faced with. But there are fantastic opportunities to turn that round. And I'm already engaged in plenty of examples around the country, which give us great hope.
And with that, bringing that into business, what can business owners do? I introduced this by thinking about the fact that, small business owners, large business owners, they've got enough on their plate trying to get the vagaries of the economy, macro environments, etc., wars, um, export issues, for us, the way in which we're doing business cross-border now with Europe, etc. This is non-political, but just to think about the issues that businesses face, and then thinking about the ecology side of things as yet another potential challenge and a drain of resources. And you've mentioned, the incentivization of business. What can be done at that level within business to help the environment and the ecosystem, as we were talking about, to actually think, right, we're doing our bit. We are now
Yeah.
within our organization adopting certain processes, etc. What can people do in that situation to make
Yeah.
biodiversity more plentiful?
Well, first thing to say is in an ideal world, businesses would be continually seeking to minimize their environmental footprint anyway. So gradually steadily getting their house in order internally. And just because it's a good thing to do, and it's morally right, they should be contributing proactively to the restoration of nature, knowing that their business probably is having an impact on nature. In an ideal world, that should just automatically happen. But that's not the case. We are essentially a selfish species, Homo sapiens, and so we need to look to what's in it for us, and that's really what businesses should be doing now. Given that they're not going to do all of these amazing things just out of the goodness of their hearts, they are looking at the bottom line. So they need to look at what's in it for them to be restoring nature beyond the boundaries of their impact. And this is where it's getting really interesting because we are now starting to see private finance come into the playing field of environmental restoration, corporate finance. So the first thing is to say is this is not going down this road is not an excuse for not cleaning up your act. You've got to be first things first. You have to make sure that you are making the maximum effort to reduce your footprint on biodiversity and climate change, etc. But at the same time as that, think about what are the impacts on your business? More prolonged and extreme flooding events, more prolonged and extreme droughts, water quality, land quality, food availability, all of these things, pollination of, by insects, for example, uh, all of these things have an impact on the products that you need to have a successful business. And that's where big corporates should be now focusing on. How can I contribute? How can we contribute in our business to reducing the impacts of these things on our business? And yes, be seen to be doing that. So, we look good and we're maybe slightly ahead of the rivals. I get that. That's fair enough. Competition is not a bad thing in these circumstances. But that's what that's what is starting to happen. I'm involved in one or two negotiations now. We're on a verge of a deal where big business is realizing that if we restore land in upper catchment areas, which makes it more resilient to floods and droughts, it holds more water for longer in the hills rather than it all rushing off billiard table intensively sheep grazed landscapes down into the valleys below and causes flooding. And at the other extreme, where we now have prolonged droughts and increased risk of wildfire, they are now realizing that it is seriously worth them investing in restoration of that upper catchment area because their businesses and their clients are downstream of that. I mean, think of pension funds and insurance companies, for example, whose profitability depends on this. So we're starting to turn the corner on that.
It's interesting you say that because from an insurance perspective, I think there isn't a person in the country in the UK that hasn't seen the cost of their insurance premiums rise.
Yeah,
And from that perspective, I'm thinking of this as a broader issue as well for people who have staff, the well-being of those staff. If they don't have access to decent water, um, good food, that whole area where they can have mindfulness outside in nature, etc., you're not going to get the optimum performance.
that's right.
People.
Yeah, it's inextricably linked to health, to health and well-being. And one of the added benefits for companies of investing in flagship projects, particularly, initial big scale rewilding type projects, is that they can strike up some kind of arrangement where there's additional access for their staff to those places. They can get involved in volunteering activities on those sites. If there's a significant financial transaction going on, then there are various extra opportunities, not just for staff who are living in that environment, as you've intimated, benefiting from it, but actually having greater engagement. And so I'm noticing that is often the ask when we're having these discussions through brokers usually, about big business investing in projects, nature recovery projects, that there will be some clauses related to direct engagement, guided walks around beaver enclosures or getting involved in tree planting as volunteers or just having a team day, on a site. So yeah, that's an example of how and why it's so important.
And the other thing is as well, how can business communities put their view to those in power in government so that more is done at that level to influence government decision in a way that even if they perceive it as more votes for the party concerned, how can they think about lobbying, getting their voices heard, helping government to change policy, to enact these environmental changes that the business owners know is going to impact in a positive way their bottom line, their businesses, future proofing, and the people that work for them and optimize their productivity to that business. How can they influence government? What is available to people to?
Yeah. I mean, well, there's the steady sort of trickle, drip, drip, drip influence that one can have, and through continual engagement at a high level, obviously chief execs and directors of major organizations will have continual contact with certain representatives in government. So using those personal conversations is really important. There are groups like the Aldersgate Group, for example, which is chaired by Theresa May, who I've presented to only last year, who are the kind of groups that are promoting sustainable business with the very biggest through the very biggest companies. So there's that sort of ongoing steady drip drip approach. But in my experience, probably 40 years now influencing national policy or trying to, um, I you need to seize the moment when there are specific pieces of legislation coming through Parliament. Uh, and right now, through the planning, the reform of the planning system, the planning bill, that, this is the opportunity, this has been the opportunity in the last year or two to influence local MPs, Lords, etc., on policy, and make sure that we don't actually slide backwards because it's not in the interest, it's not even in the interest of developers to be deregulating because it will just turn into a cowboy minefield. And the the honest, genuinely sustainable developers or those who are aiming to be as sustainable as possible, they will suffer if we start to deregulate. So those people need to be speaking out. But I've found that over the years, you've got to latch on to specific pieces of legislation as they go through Parliament and put extra effort into influencing them at that time. Because once you get that in place, that gives you a certain amount of stability and opportunity to move forward.
Mm. And then thinking about the broader picture for the UK, and you mentioned that we're a country that is severely behind others within our framework of rewilding, how we're using our countryside for the benefit of natural habitats, etc. I'd love to hear some statistics from you as to what is being done at the moment to rewild and why that's happening, and also how much more there is to go and the steps that can be taken to be able to help this percentage of what we're giving back to nature actually improve on a grand scale.
Yeah, so we're behind in terms of the state of our nature. We're not behind in terms of the effort that we're putting in to try and correct that. Um, but that's simply because we have trashed more than most countries around the world because we have been trashing for a couple of hundred years. Whereas other countries, it's much more recent. So many other countries still have core, significant core areas of trophic intactness, of where they've got basically the whole ecosystem, and they might be missing a few key species, but generally speaking, the ecosystem is in good health, but it's under threat, for example, from deforestation. So that sort of thing applies in parts of Eastern Europe, for example. And obviously, in more tropical countries, there is still quite a lot of intact forest left. Although, as you know, it's a big issue. Deforestation is still a major issue. But we have a lower baseline, but the amount of effort that's going in to put that right is very significant. But just to put that in perspective, I've collected the stats from all of the sites that I have advised over the last 10 years or so in England and Wales. And I estimate that probably in England and Wales, we are looking at less than 1% rewilding. In other words, natural processes, nature is allowed to lead, and man is quite rapidly removing his detrimental impact. Less than 1%. If we take Britain as a whole, it's 2%, but most of the 2% is in Scotland. So that's where we're at the moment. I can't give you global figures because my work with the Global Rewilding Alliance is just getting going. It's a relatively new charity. I've just become their first sort of senior advisor, and we're actually literally heading off to the Netherlands this weekend for a Rewilding Our World conference where I'll be for the first time meeting the rest of the team and hearing amazing stories from across the world. But coming back to the UK, one of the key stats that I've been able to show through collecting data from the big projects, I try to focus on big scale stuff, but it's not very big, by the way. We're only talking, a couple of hundred acres in size. It's not, compared with what's going on in Australia, where you're talking millions of acres being protected, and South America, and indeed in parts of the USA. We are only talking about a few hundred acres here, a few thousand acres there. Um, but I've got a significant chunk of data from about nearly 60 sites. And the key stat that I can show from that is that full-time equivalent jobs have more than doubled across those sites as a result of rewilding. And that, if I had 2 minutes in a lift with a politician, that's the stat that I would wave in their face, because that demonstrates that if you are restoring nature at scale, you will probably need to diversify your sources of income because it just wouldn't work with having the whole area plastered with sheep or dairy cattle or arable. You're going to have to go into a mix of activities and a mix of income sources if you're going to engage that way with nature and restore nature that way. But if you do that, you can generate far more opportunities for income sources. So you're not putting all your funding eggs in one basket. You've probably got multiple strands of income coming in. Could be nature tourism, health and well-being, education, food. Yes, still these sites still produce some food, but it's about half. Again, I've got stats on that show it's just under half the amount of food that comes out of these sites. But these are sites that were not productive beforehand. They were marginally productive or unproductive. Landowners weren't making a profit. So I think that those socioeconomic benefits are the gold dust in the array of benefits that we see coming out of rewilding projects. It's not just about nature. Again, coming back to the selfish species thing, what's in it for us? Well, what's in it for us is actually greater socioeconomic resilience.
And with that 1%, and with 2% being United Kingdom, but the 1% still being in Scotland, so that's the place where the most of it's going on. A lot of people would argue that, well, actually, we're a small island in comparison to Australia. We haven't got that much space to begin with. It's ever needed for construction, development, etc., for an expanding community and population. Well, how can we? How
Yeah.
can we get more out of it? So, what can people be thinking about, especially if you're a business owner, one, getting involved in investing in this type of area so that you know that you're doing your bit and you're seeing benefits coming back to your business on the bottom line. What can people be doing to expand that 1%?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw another stat at you, Deborah. There's a key stat, which is 20% of Britain produces 3% of the calories that we consume. That's in the National Food Strategy, produced by Henry Dimbleby a few years ago now for government. And it's very significant. 20% of this country produces 3%. And that's because that 20% is largely upland or unimproved, non-profitable land that is very hard to farm and is largely empty of people. So although we are quite a densely populated country, actually, like many countries around the world now, the vast majority of our population is in conurbations. And actually, the countryside is emptying. There are more and more people leaving the countryside. And we need to find a way of holding them there. And I would argue that rewilding is one of those ways because for the reasons I've described. So that 20% is where we should particularly focus. I'm not dismissing urban rewilding. I've been involved in some flagship urban rewilding projects, and I'm on the London Mayor's rewilding task force. And yes, urban rewilding is important, but it's generally going to be very small scale. But I'm particularly focusing on these rural areas where very few people live, where they're struggling economically, where there are very few jobs, if any, and there's this exodus from those areas. That's where businesses should think, well, is there anything near me, particularly, and I come from a rivers background, so river catchments are my sort of baseline kind of geographic structure, if you like, that I think about. And it is important because particularly when we're talking about floods and drought and water quality, river catchments, water catchments are basically the way we should look at things, not county boundaries. They're just made up human lines on a map. So business should be looking within their catchment area, say the Severn or the Thames or the River Aire in Yorkshire, wherever they are, say, right, what major initiatives are happening in the upper parts of these catchments that are delivering nature recovery at scale and that are helping to reduce the impacts of climate change by slowing the flow of water. They're going to improve the water quality. So, potentially the water that my business is using will not have to have such expensive treatment on it on the long in the long term. They need to be looking at those areas and thinking, right, how can I team up? Either directly with individual initiatives or through a broker or through maybe a project that's already in place. Though we're starting to see catchment scale projects that are doing this kind of thing. And you're basically then going to marry buyers with sellers. The buyers are the businesses, the sellers are the people who have the land, who are willing to make the changes necessary on that land to benefit society as a whole.
And have you any examples of that actually happening at the moment successfully?
Yeah, well, I'll give you, I mean, I've got plenty, but I'm going to inevitably give you the one that I'm most heavily involved in, which is Broughton Sanctuary in Yorkshire. So 2,500 acre country estate. When I was invited along by the landowner to talk rewilding 6 years ago, the entire estate was very intensively grazed with sheep. So it looked basically it's billiard table grasslands, bright green with stone walls. Classic sort of Yorkshire Dalesy kind of landscape, just outside the national park, actually, but that kind of landscape. And the landowner had, off his own bat, had realised that, you know, he needed to be looking at how this land was managed for the future because he was conscious that it wasn't delivering much in the way of nature. And here's the 32nd generation on that land.
Wow.
Since for about 1,000 years they've been there. So this is quite a big deal, to actually start to look at land management in a different way. But we have implemented a lot of the original proposals we discussed. Within 2 years, we planted 220,000 trees. We've planted another 100,000 plus since then. So we removed the sheep grazing from half the estate. There's still intensive sheep on some of it, but now a lot of it is very young woodland, rough grassland, scrub, wildflowers, nature bursting out of the seams. I mean, just staggering numbers of things, bioabundance going through the roof. I do moth trapping. I used to catch 10, 20, 30 moths on a decent night. Now I'm catching 500 to 1,000 on some good night. Unbelievable numbers,
Wow.
reminiscent of my childhood in the 60s in the Cotswolds. Um, Birds of prey that we never had before, long-eared owl, short-eared owl, merlin, hen harrier coming back, red kites moving in, barn owls everywhere. We've now got a beaver enclosure, which is just fantastic. The beavers are creating these amazing wetlands. We got otters turning up in places they never turned up in on the estate before. So right there, you've got an amazing project, and that has been funded by the Trees for Climate Fund, which paid for the tree planting, which is a government fund aimed at mitigating the impacts of climate change. That's going to benefit people downstream significantly. So it's also tied in with the River Aire natural flood management program, which is to help reduce flood risk in Leeds and big cities downstream. So we're a big player. Broughton's a big player in that program of work because it's planted a lot of trees. It was the biggest project in the country in that first phase 4 years ago. So right there, you've got an example of where government funding, in that case, has enabled fantastic work to happen. And now we're at the stage of negotiating private finance. So I want to restore the River Aire floodplain wetlands. We want to create ponds, and because there's very little water actually sitting in on the land. I mean, obviously we trap more water in the vegetation and the more sustainably managed land, but we also need to restore our wetlands there because they've tended to be historically drained. So we're looking to reverse the clock on that. And so this is an example where we're looking at private finance, and I think we're very close now to a significant arrangement being signed off. And then you have this wonderful private-public partnership, which is what the government's always been seeking. So yeah, it's Broughton Sanctuary. It's near Skipton for anyone who's in that part of the country. We've created a 30-kilometre permissive path through the site with information that goes with it, so people can come and visit, walk around it, learn about it.
Terrific. And I think that this is a great place to end the podcast because there is so much opportunity out there for business to get involved with this and to change and future-proof our country in the UK. And if you're listening internationally, your countries as well, and see that then for the generations, as I say, 32 generations on that land, well, for the next 32 generations that come, it would be amazing to think that we can get back that symbiotic relationship that we seem to have lost over the last few decades quite quickly, I hasten to add. But if we can reverse that and actually start off as we mean to leave a legacy to the generations to come as well and take part in it too right now, which is always fun, I think that's absolutely fantastic. So Professor Alastair, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. How can people get hold of you?
Well, I would encourage people to follow me in social media. So I'm on Instagram, and it's Rewilding Driver is my tag there, and I'm still hanging in on X. Uh, whether that's a good thing or not, I've decided to stay on there, and you can get me there at Ali Driver UK.
Perfect. Lovely. Thank you very much again.
Great, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And for everybody listening, thank you as always, because it wouldn't be the same without you. Absolutely, totally appreciate the fact that you take the time, you listen and you watch and you support us, which is fantastic. Please do get behind Professor Alastair's mission. It's a great one to have. And the countryside, the wildlife, etc. It is just so beautiful, especially those birds of prey. I have to say they are captivating watching them do their thing. I've had the privilege of that, and I have been to the Broughton Sanctuary, as you say, and it's an amazing place. So if anybody would like to visit there, also get in touch with Alastair and Broughton because it's going to be a fantastic time to actually have a look and see the great work that they're doing and all the other places that are taking part in this as well. So until next time, be successful. We'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye now.